Good morning and welcome to CPAR's Data and Research Series for Community Impact. We are so glad you joined us again this morning. Let's talk a little bit about today. So this morning, kicking off right here at 9 a.m. Central, we are going to have several presentations on Decoding Nebraska, exploring state and local trends in demographics, workforce, and socioeconomics. Allison Shafer from the United States Census Bureau's Geography Division is going to kick us off this morning, exploring rural and urban geographies. I actually just saw Allison present actually this summer at the State Data Center Conference for the United States Census Bureau. And she did a great job explaining these two elements of our geography that I know that are important everywhere, but really important in context here in Nebraska, and terms we really use a lot to describe the geography of Nebraska. So important to get a real sense of how those work and how they're measured. Then we'll take a short break at 10:45 and be back at 11 a.m. for a panel on creating meaningful data visualizations and communications, and really exploring diverse perspectives to make sure our insights from data viz are impactful. Expert panel that we're really excited to have. Then coming up, we are offering a part 3. So we did part 1. This is part 2. These are sort of the official sessions in the series, but we are offering sort of this creative new part 3. These are small group consultation sessions with folks from the Center for Public Affairs Research. And we want to address specific data questions, data and research questions you all have. We have had lots of great registrations for those. Those that have registered, be looking for an email for us. We want to reach out before those sessions get started and make sure we are talking about things that are useful to you. So that's what's coming up in the series. We're so glad, again, that you joined us. So a couple things for today before we kick it off. We are recording. These recordings and all the materials, PowerPoints, links, websites, anything we say or mention, we're going to make sure they are available on that website you received when registering. That website is available only to registrants for 1 year. Please don't share that website out. You will note that on that website, we also have access to information from past series. So we do make it available publicly after a year. A lot of the information from last year is still really relevant based on data release timelines. So feel free to check that out, but please don't share this webpage out. It's for you. So Allison Shafer is the supervisory geographer in the Geography Division of the United States Census Bureau. Hi, Allison, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us here in Central Time Zone. And I'm gonna turn it over to you. How's that sound?
Sounds great. Thanks, Josie.
Thank you.
My name is Allison Shafer, and I am a supervisory geographer. I'm in the Statistical Area Boundaries branch in the Geography Division at the U.S. Census Bureau. And today I'm going to discuss the 2020 Census urban areas and some related geographies, including the core-based statistical areas, which include the metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas. So first, I'm going to get into talking about the urban areas and what urban areas are, how they're delineated, and some key trends we saw for the 2020 Census urban areas. And then I'll discuss the core-based statistical areas, or CBSAs, what they are, the Census Bureau Geography Division's role in those geographies, and the different types of CBSAs. And like Josie said, feel free to put any questions in the chat, and I'll probably answer them towards the end. I also have with me one of my colleagues, Chris Henry. He's been working on urban areas for, I believe, decades. So if I can't answer something, he'll be there to back me up. So first we'll get into just some basic information about urban and rural definitions. So one thing that's really important to note is that there's not one single definition of what urban and rural is universally, and that definition, or a definition that's used by all levels of government or even within the federal government. So tribal, federal, state, and local government agencies and offices all develop different definitions depending on their programmatic needs and uses. And some of those needs and uses include allocating program funds, setting program standards, and implementing and measuring aspects of their programs. And while not all the definitions are the same, they generally kind of follow this flow where most definitions will begin with a geographic delineation, such as the Census Bureau's urban and rural definitions. And then the specific agency or office will apply criteria based on their program. And that results in the urban area definition that's used by that agency or office. So, for instance, the Farm Bill has over 50 definitions of urban and rural, depending on the purpose. These are just a few of the federal agencies that do use the urban and rural definitions for their business needs. These are some of the more commonly used federal geographic delineation sources used by federal agencies. Most federal definitions are based on the Census Bureau urban areas and rural territory and or the metropolitan and micropolitan areas. Rural urban commuting areas, or RUCAs, are another commonly used geographic delineation. And on this slide, there's just a couple things I want to point out. So first, if you look at the last column, you'll see that both the metropolitan and micropolitan areas and the RUCAs are both built on census urban areas. They take the Census Bureau's urban areas and then apply additional criteria to them to generate their geographic delineations. And then second to note is the unit of geography that's used. Of these three geographies listed, the census blocks, which the urban areas or the census urban areas and rural territory are based off of, are the smallest. Then census tracts, which are larger and consist of many blocks. And then counties, which the metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas are built off of, those consist of one or more tracts. So based on that, the urban areas that the Census Bureau delineates have the finest geographic resolution, and the core-based statistical areas, or CBSAs, have the coarsest. So what are the Census Bureau's urban areas? The Census Bureau's urban areas are geographic areas that represent densely developed territory, and they encompass residential, commercial, and other non-residential urban land uses. And they're delineated to identify individual urban areas and the rural portion of the nation. So why is it important? Why does the Census Bureau delineate urban areas? Like many of the other geographic boundaries that the Census Bureau produces, the Census Bureau delineates urban areas for statistical data tabulation, publication, and analysis. As I mentioned, we do recognize that many tribal, federal, state, and local governments define their program requirements based on these urban and rural definitions. And because of this, the Census Bureau actively engages stakeholders to weigh in on the criteria we use for our urban areas. We also invite stakeholders to ask questions, and we work very closely with tribal, federal, state, and local agencies to ensure there's understanding of how we're classifying urban and rural areas. And just to give a timeline, the Census Bureau delineates urban areas after each decennial census, and we finalized and announced the 2020 Census urban area delineations in December of 2022. So this diagram depicts the current urban area program life cycle. So if we start here, this is kind of where we are right now. We published the urban areas and urban area products, and now we're in the phase of starting to evaluate the urban areas and innovate and learn from the previous decade. The urban area program cycle is cyclical in that once we publish the urban areas and our products, we evaluate the previous delineation shortly afterwards. we begin to evaluate the criteria, the delineation process we use, seeking feedback from data users and analysts, and also conducting our own evaluations. And then based on that input, we're able to develop proposed criteria and evaluate or enhance our delineation methodology. So some of this could be based on if there's new available data sources and technology that can be used for these delineations. And then, once we develop our proposed criteria, we publish that criteria for comment in the Federal Register notice. And then again, give an opportunity for data users to send comments and provide feedback so that we can make sure, we're analyzing and making sure we are taking into account, the criteria that is meaningful for users or other agencies, people using the urban and rural areas. We want to make sure we're not changing something that's, completely frowned upon. And then finally, we'll publish our final criteria and finalize our methodology. And then after the decennial census, we delineate our urban areas. One thing to note is that there's no appeals process for changing urban area boundaries once they're published by the Census Bureau. The main opportunity for interested data users to participate is prior to that delineation, especially during the multiple opportunities for the development of the criteria. Once we delineate or the delineations have been published, the only really changes that we'll consider are if we found that our criteria was not properly applied. So just to give a heads up, in the coming years, we will be starting that process of collecting comments, collecting input. And currently we always welcome feedback. So if folks have ideas or things to consider, please don't hesitate to share them with us. On a later slide is our contact information. So just a little bit of history here about urban area delineation. Urban and rural have been defined by the Census Bureau since the late 1800s. And as you can imagine, there's been a lot of change in that definition and delineation since then. We have used, or historically, the delineations have been marked by change and reevaluation of those thresholds and criteria for delineating urban areas, like I mentioned in the last slide. The criteria that we're most familiar with began with the 1950 census, when the Census Bureau began defining density-based urban areas based on housing unit density, and including non-contiguous high-density areas based on jumps across low-density territory. And then beginning with the 2000 census, the urban area delineation process has become more of a automated process rather than an interactive process to kind of further reduce some of that subjectivity that could be added in. And again, we're continuously refining our processes as data that we can use to define some of these areas for addressing non-contiguous areas or adding area to urban areas. And as technology advances and we have different tools we can analyze and use to better delineate the urban areas. So how do we delineate? The Census Bureau tries to use a nationally consistent, objective approach to create the urban areas and rural territory. And they We are delineating with the intention of meeting the needs of many and often conflicting uses of various data users. Since there's a range of analysts and users that are interested in these definitions for statistical purposes. For the 2020 urban area delineations, the final delineation criteria were implemented using different technologies and data. So for instance, we used a Python-based delineation software. We took into account, of course, census blocks and decennial census block level housing and population data. We took into account impervious surface, hydrography, and wetlands data coming from the MAF Tiger system, which is the Census Bureau's database, the National Land Cover Data Set, and the Coastal Change Analysis Program data. We also took into account commuting data from the Census Bureau's longitudinal employer household dynamics, origin destination employment statistics, or LOADS data. So at a national level, some of the key trends that we saw for the 2020 urban areas as compared to the 2010 urban areas were that a similar percent of population and housing units were urban versus rural between the two decades. There was a decrease in the total number of urban areas, but an increase in the number of urban areas with greater than or equal to 5,000 in population. There was a decrease in many urban areas' size and land area, but an increase in population and housing density of urban areas. Some 2010 urban areas became 2 urban areas in 2020, and some 2020 urban areas include areas with densely developed seasonal housing. And some of these trends are due to different criteria changes that were vetted and implemented for the 2020 census urban area delineations. So again, just looking a little bit more at the national level metrics, there are a high level of similarities between the 2010 and 2020 census urban areas. The percent urban and rural populations stayed nearly consistent between 2010 and 2020, with nearly 81% of the US population being urban in 2010, and approximately 19% of the population was rural. Whereas the percentages for urban were 80% and the percentage for rural was 20% for 2020. So pretty similar urban and rural proper population percentages between the decades. And then looking at the metrics for the state of Nebraska in particular, the percent of urban population between 2010 and 2020 actually remained the same. However, we do see that the number of urban areas decreased from 43 urban areas in 2010 to 30 urban areas in 2020. And this map just depicts the 2020 census urban areas for the state of Nebraska. All of the dark green areas with the labels are the Nebraska 2020 census urban areas. And then, of course, I mentioned we do publish 2020 census urban area products. Those are available on the Census Bureau's website. And we provide the urban and rural classifications, in like tabular format. We provide tiger line shape files of the urban areas, and we also have Tiger Web, which provides REST and map services. Tiger Web is like an online application that you can view, but you can also from Tiger Web access REST services and WMS services to pull into your own mapping software. So next, I'll discuss core-based statistical areas. So some important details about core-based statistical areas, or CBSAs. CBSAs are established and maintained by the Office of Management and Budget for statistical purposes And they provide a nationally consistent set of data for delineations for collecting, tabulating, and publishing federal statistics for geographic areas. As a whole, they're defined as an area that contains a large population nucleus or urban area, and then adjacent communities that have a high degree of integration with that nucleus. And to be a core-based statistical area, they must have a Census Bureau urban area of at least 10,000 in population. So I mentioned that the Office of Management and Budget are actually the folks that delineate the core-based statistical areas. So the Census Bureau's geography division does play a small role in this, but not in the delineations. We provide the urban area delineations that are used so we provide the urban area delineations to the Office of Management and Budget that are used to delineate the core-based statistical areas. And then once LMB delineates the CBSAs, we are provided the data, and then we update our MathTiger system with that data, and then we produce spatial products to depict the CBSAs. So again, our collection of shape files and web services and our online mapping application. So there's a couple different types of core-based statistical areas. Of course, we have the metropolitan statistical areas, the micropolitan statistical areas. We have metropolitan divisions and combined statistical areas. New for the latest delineation, a couple types of core-based statistical areas were discontinued, and those include the New England City and Town areas, or NECTAs, NECTA divisions, and combined NECTAs. So I'm just going to kind of give a brief definition of each of these. The metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas are very conceptually similar to each other, but the difference is that the micropolitan areas feature a smaller nucleus. Both metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas are composed of entire counties, and they consist of central counties, which are those that contain the population nucleus mentioned previously, and then outlying counties, which qualify to join a central county based on providing sufficient commuting with that central county or counties in that area. And then the nuclei we discuss is identified by the Census Bureau's Urban Areas Program. And the urban area has to have 50,000 people or more to be a metropolitan statistical area, or 10,000 people or more in population to be a micropolitan statistical area. Combined statistical areas are geographic entities of 2 or more adjacent CBSAs with employment interchange measures of at least 15. And an employment interchange is, it measures the tie between the 2 adjacent entities, and it's the sum of the percentage of workers living in the smaller entity who work in the larger entity, and the percentage of the employment in the smaller entity that is accounted for by the workers in the larger entity. So they have to have that 15%, or the sum of 15% to be a combined statistical area. And then metropolitan divisions are a county or group of counties within a CBSA that contain an urban area with a population of at least 2.5 million. And again, it consists of 1 or more counties that represent an employment center or centers, plus adjacent counties associated with or associated through commuting ties. So this slide just kind of gives an idea of the relationship between urban areas and core-based statistical areas, and how they're related with each other. So we see here the 2020 census urban areas in green, and the metropolitan areas area is in like purple, and the micropolitan area is in pink. And if we look at Lincoln, Nebraska, or the 2020 census Lincoln, Nebraska urban area, we see that there are 291,217 people in that urban area. So that makes this urban area a nucleus for a metropolitan area due to its population. And then if we look at Beatrice, Nebraska urban area, we see that there are 12,142 people in the urban area, which is greater than the 10,000 threshold, which makes this a nucleus of a micropolitan area. And then this map just shows the metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas in the state of Nebraska. And then we, like I mentioned, we do produce products for the core-based statistical areas, and they can be found on the Census Bureau's website. The Tigerline shapefiles and Tiger Web updates won't be active until later in October, but the delineation files that the population division at the Census Bureau produces are available on the website at this link. And then if there's any questions, we do have a web page for the urban areas team. And because the core-based statistical areas are handled by the population division and they work closely with the Office of Management and Budget, there's a different point of contact for the core-based statistical area delineation questions. And that is all I have for this update. Are there any questions?
We did have a question come in, and I have a couple for you as well, but let's jump to what the attendees asked first. The 2020 redefinition of urban from 2,500 to 5,000 people took about 1,100 small towns out of the urban category. Will Census formally evaluate the impacts? And actually, that's a good question, right? Like, these definitions do have an impact, right? They're used in lots of different programs. And, you know, I think they're really important for communities as they're thinking about their growth and population change. So more than anything, these things are important and they do get used. So do you feel that any of the changes in the definition will impact some of that programmatic?
I mean, I think any of the criteria changes do impact the urban areas. But I think it also depends on the programs that are using the urban areas to kind of define, you know, we're just delineating based on the various criteria that we're putting out there, but the programs all use, like the programs, federal, whoever's using urban areas are all using them differently or redefining. So I think, yes, it impacts, but we have little control of how it impacts specific programs because those programs are kind of who has to decide how to use the urban and rural definitions that we provide. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Chris, if he has anything to weigh in on this, because like I said, he's been dealing with urban areas for decades.
Hi, yes, this is Chris. My audible?
Yes.
Yep.
So technology works. So yeah, every decade that we change the criteria, and yes, it does change every decade depending on available technology at the time and lessons learned from past delineations and so forth. And every time there is a change, it is going to affect somebody somewhere somehow. And however that is all dependent on the program that's using the urban areas for their specific purposes, and it may be beneficial or in a negative sense. And oftentimes it's both for communities, depending on the program. So, for example, like you may have a urban area that prefers to be over a certain threshold, let's say 50,000 population, which puts them in a different metropolitan category, which gives them access to different types of funding streams for, let's say, transportation. But now, if that urban area, the criteria changes and it drops them below that 50,000 threshold, well, now that transportation organization may not like that, but it may be beneficial to another organization in that same community, such as rural healthcare and rural education. And so it's all going to depend on the perspective of whichever program. And this is why we stay out of that. I don't want to say argument, but we stay out. We remain objective and try to be as agnostic as we can when it comes down to effects on program funding streams and stuff of that nature. And so, yeah, it will affect people. and it's going to be both positive and negative across the board. But we don't do any analyses on our own. That is not our responsibility. This is why we always make the disclaimer. I think Allison said we do this only for our statistical purposes, and we do not recognize. Well, we recognize that this is used for programmatic purposes at all levels of the government, but we're not designing these for any particular one. We're doing it for our statistical purposes and reporting and what we consider to be urban, and not what other programs should consider to be urban. And we encourage them all to use our divinations and modify them for their own purposes.
Yeah, I can think of an example here in Nebraska. We work with the Nebraska Department of Transportation on rural transit, and there are rural transit agencies across the state. Most counties have one, but there are some that would, right, they're near urban areas, but they are small urban areas. So the whole county, because much of the county is rural, even though there's an urban area within the county, they would still qualify for rural transit funding, even though, you know, they may call themselves urban or they are urban on some dimension, right? So there's a lot of like fungibility within these definitions sort of in practice, but so important to make these distinctions, particularly as we're releasing this statistical information, right? Because we are trying to compare and contrast different aspects of our geography, and they're really meaningful. Allison, a lot of the times I don't use rural urban because I think people have an idea of what urban is as compared to what rural is. And maybe they think Omaha, but as we saw, there are urban areas across the state. So I tend to use metropolitan, non-metropolitan, or metropolitan and micropolitan and non that. What's your sense of that being useful or not? Do you see that a lot with that? Do those distinctions work just as well in practice?
I'm not really in the business of applying the distinctions, so I can't really speak to that because I think it depends on what the need is, or what the the data usage is, or the purpose for using it. Um, so I don't, because I think there's not really a right or wrong way in how you're using the two dependently. I don't really have an opinion on it, because I'm not a knowledgeable opinion on it, because I just haven't had to think in that way. I don't know, Chris, if you've had experience with people discussing how they're using metropolitan versus urban areas, or, interchanging for their needs.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on the scale of what you're looking at, really, is what it comes down to. So first, let me put it this way: the metropolitan areas are used for arguably even more funding programs than urban areas are. One thing is because they're much easier to deal with because they're a county-based level, and it is kind of a bit more of a in concept, more something that's kind of easier to wrap your head around, because people can say metropolitan, like, okay, well, Omaha, that's clearly metropolitan urban, right? But I can't name a small town in Nebraska right now. I used to be able to. I'm actually from Kansas, so
Midwest, yeah.
yes, there you go. But
Yeah, but we have a lot of small ones. I've actually
yes.
shown a similar side. So it was the last decade to elected officials, right? And they're like, wait, that's urban? Like, yeah, technically, yes, right? So it is a little bit easier to understand.
Yeah.
One last question for y'all.
Oh, go ahead.
The Census Bureau obviously takes this very seriously. There is this long process you showed. And so in that way, we know it's important. We know it's important for a lot of programmatic reasons. But as that process has become more automated, you also mentioned too, even though there's, right, we're putting the information out, we're getting feedback before we do it, but it's really sort of a very technical approach to defining these things. How do you feel about that process? What's your level of confidence that when we sort of put in the numbers and say, go find this? And that, Allison, too, you didn't get into like the skips and the hops and the jumps, but it's really kind of an interesting, very technical approach. Like, how confident are we feeling when we produce this set of numbers that we're finding all of the places that meet these criteria?
Well, I think being able to use the technology allows us to better use the data that's out there as if you were interactively trying to hunt and find, especially with GIS software and spatial software, hunt and find where things are supposed to equal certain criteria. So it allows us to put in the various criteria and systematically go about generating and delineating the urban areas so that there's less subjectivity. We're able to, it's not just guesstimating what is actually meeting that criteria. I mean, with urban areas, though, there is some, like, always a little bit of interactive following up at the end, just to like make sure, kind of like quality control, make sure what the software did was right and, makes sense. But again, it I think allows you to better capture and utilize the different data sets together to kind of formulate that delineation. And I think we're pretty confident in how being able to rely on, the computer's going to do it better than if we were independently, searching for this meets this criteria, and because it's a lot easier to miss something if you're just relying on your human eye to like identify, what should be considered as urban or,
We did have someone comment on how the varying definition of urban and rural, not only a cultural issue, but a legal government issue. And I think we've talked about this a little bit too. But right, I think people ascribe a lot of meaning outside of to the words urban and rural. And I think it was really important for this presentation today to understand this is actually a very technical definition that we're doing really precisely to be able to describe area. And they don't have the same connotation that I think a lot of people bring to the terms, right? And so when a place like Fairbury, for instance, Fairbury, Nebraska is a pretty small town, is considered urban, people go, excuse me? But right, we're trying to say that it's not what you think of as urban, but there are this really clear technical definition that helps us to describe an area. And it's really about density and land use and commuting patterns, right? Like these things that we might not think of when we say the word urban. So for that, I really appreciate this presentation. Allison and Chris, thanks for joining us. We love our Census Bureau friends coming in for our State Data Center conference. So really appreciate your time and your thoughts. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate it. And if you have questions, our contact information will be in the slides. So please don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to help, provide any insight.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right, everybody. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and get into some detail about what this all means. We had a really technical conversation about how we describe place, and now I want to look less at the technical aspects and dig in on the individuals within them. Decoding Nebraska. So excitingly, we just had the 2022 one-year American Community Survey data product released. It was released here in September earlier this month. And so this is the most up-to-date information about population characteristics, that socio-demographic information. Just a reminder, the American Community Survey is a very dense, can take up to 40 minutes to complete survey product. So different than the decennial census, which is an official count of every individual, but very few questions asked, or the population estimates program, which is a statistical program. It's not a survey program at all, that tries to come up with the official numbers similar to the decennial census, but without actually going through that process of counting everybody. The American Community Survey asks questions about ancestry, citizenship, disability, educational attainment, fertility, grandparents, language, marital status, migration, school enrollment, veterans, age, race and ethnicity, type of worker, commuting patterns, employment status, health insurance. I could go on. This survey is unlike any other survey in the United States. 3.5 million respondents annually. I compared that to just a Pew Research poll, not trying to pick on the Pew Research poll. They do really great work too, but one poll that they might release for the nation can have a total of 1,500 people. And they said that's a pretty good sample for generalizing. And that might absolutely be true. But when we are using a survey of this size, we can really try to estimate and weight the data to the exact number, which is what it tries to do. But I tell people not to think of this as the official counts. I really try not to look at the numbers at all, but we're really trying to describe the people within there. I've gone ahead and linked for the 2022 one-year release 4 tables that are sort of, you know, the best hits of the American Community Survey. Social characteristics, economic characteristics, housing, and demographic. I had it to 2021 5-year in part 1. Now with the 2022 one-year release, I went ahead and linked these. If you're trying to get a sense of what the American Community Survey has, this is a great place to start. You might also use this if you want more detailed tables or microdata. You really want to get more information about folks. You're studying contemporary change over time. This is a long-term survey, so you can go back to 2010. And you're examining political geographies, legislative districts, counties, cities, zip code, school district. They're going to release data at these geographies that we're really used to thinking about. So really interesting contrast to the last presentation, right? Cities, the boundaries of a city change all the time, right? They may annex new land, maybe they're close to another city and they take over services to one area or things like that. And so, you know, they're going to use geography, they're going to release data at geographies we sort of know and understand versus a more technical definition of a rural or urban, for example. 2022 one-year estimates were just released. The 5-year estimates are not released until December 7th. The one-year data is great because it does come out a little bit sooner than the 5-year data. It's based on just the 12 months of data in that year. But because they are not, and they don't average across the 5 years, a lot of people are like, oh, it's centered on this year, so it's really data for that year with the 5-year and all these kind of things. The data for the 5-year, when it is released, will be for 2022. But they're going to use data going back in time, 60 months instead of just the 12 months, to really deal with some sort of spikes and hops and outliers and things like that that can happen in data to kind of smooth that trend and really build confidence so we can lower that margin for error that we're getting it right. It's part of the weighting procedures and things like that. So we can build a little bit more confidence. So the one-year data is great because it comes out a little bit quicker, but we really can't use it for smaller geographies. So in fact, in Nebraska, it was only released for 3 counties. So it's released for the state, Douglas County, Lancaster County, and Sarpy County. So it's not even released for Hall. So you really just have very limited information at that lower level. Also, if you're getting into a lot of like population subgroups, I wouldn't spend too much time looking at the data as well. But still something we wanted to talk about today, considering its recent release and some really interesting changes. So here's a list of the things that I think are interesting in 2022. Median household income, $69,697. Poverty rates, 11.2%. Work from home, 10.8%. Jumping around a little. High school graduate or more, 92.8%. Vacant housing using were 7%. Median value of owner-occupied housing is $232,400. So these are Nebraska's 2022 numbers. Oh, someone did ask, is the ACS one-year reported by MSA? Yes, so you can get it by metropolitan statistical area for So that's Omaha, Council Bluffs, Lincoln, and Grand Island, Kearney. And so today I really want to talk about some of the 2022 numbers, but I want to put sort of a spin on how we talk about those numbers with this focus on decoding. I put that in the title of this presentation because I think it's an interesting way to think about data. So the official definition is to convert into intelligible language. And in this case, right, these numbers are what's not intelligible. They're numbers. We kind of know what they mean. You might make a little sense of them, right? Based on your experience with some of these numbers, but otherwise we really don't. What do they mean? They don't tell us anything. And so how do we go from numbers into intelligible language? I like this, to analyze and interpret, right? How do we make sense of these numbers? How do we go from here's a number to we know something about these numbers? And this comes up a lot in our work. People will ask me for a number and then they're like, well, what do I do with it? And so I want to talk about our process when we're trying to make sense of numbers. So our tips for decoding, it's all about comparison and contrast. So last year we did, we talked about some data and we talked about sort of using argumentation as a way to, the tips of argumentation to construct meaning. Here we're going to talk about comparison and contrast as ways to make meaning of this data. And specifically, we'll talk about year, geography, grouping, looking at XY relationships, how does X impact Y, and then using context clues to just really help people move along. So getting from data to knowing. And we're going to do it in context of the 2022 one-year release, as well as some recent briefs we have done. Housing availability and quality in Nebraska, I think we put it online yesterday or the day before. Exploring remote work in Nebraska, we released a little bit earlier this fall. The foreign-born population, again, we did that going back a little bit. An infographic on poverty, really saw some changes in poverty in 2022, so I wanted to come back to that a little bit, as well as our recently released Nebraska Tech Collaborative Data Dashboard that we did with the Nebraska Tech Collaborative, powered by the Exarban Foundation. All of these briefs are on our website, cpar.unomaha.edu, and they're actually probably the easiest way to get to them all is to go to hashtag Nebraska by the numbers. The other thing I want to tell you is when you see public products from CPAR, it is most likely 5-year data. Okay, so these numbers are going to look different. The numbers I'm going to present today in some places will look a little bit different than the numbers in these briefs. 1-year and 5-year data are different. I showed that actually in that slide where I showed 1-year versus 5-year data. That was just a screenshot of the differences, right? The numbers are different. They're not very different. That's the nature of this work. But we tend to use the 5-year data as much as possible for public releases. So there are choices. We try to let people know when we make those choices, but just realize if you're seeing numbers that are slightly different, they're not very different, but they might be slightly different because we tend to use the 5-year. And I do suggest to all of you, whenever possible, use the 5-year. So let's get started with decoding, talking about year to begin. So all I've done here is take those same set of numbers that I think are particularly interesting for 2022, and I've compared them to 2021 just by giving you an up and down arrow. And truly, while this is not fancy data visualization at all, we've started to make sense of this data. We've started to tell you something about what it means, how we know something about this data. For instance, the poverty rate went up. That might be something that you don't need to know the trend over time, but you don't like the poverty rate going up. Now you know it went up, and so it may inspire you to action. It may inspire you to dive deeper into the data, but it's giving you some context that moves you along. And it's really very little context, yet it does provide something you didn't have before. The way I went about this actually was looking at this comparison profiles table. So just like the DP tables I mentioned, the CP tables, what they do is compare 2022 to 2021, and they actually tell you if things are statistically significant. Are they different at a statistical level, right? They don't say this is why they're different, or this is how they're different. It doesn't even tell you if it's up or down. You have to make that judgment yourself, but it does tell you if it's different. Most of the data products from the Census Bureau don't provide these statistical significance because they're not in comparison and contrast, right? Most tables just tell you this is the number for the year you selected. Maybe you go into mapping and you compare by geography a little bit, but we really don't have this data. You do have the margin of error, so you can start to think about, do I have confidence in this data? But this is really the only table I know of that gives you this indicator that something's different. So for instance, median household income, like I said on the last slide, went down from 2021 to 2022, and it's significantly down. Now, is it a huge number? No, but it meets this standard of statistical significance. But essentially, we're just giving you an indication that, yeah, this matters. The way I get to this table is I type in CP in the search bar. It knows that I want this. You have it for the same 4 topic areas as you do the DP, and you can do this over time so you can compare other years. Only compare 1 year to 1 year or 5 year to 5 year. Don't compare 5 year to 1 year. So, right, again, now when I tell you, and all of these are statistically significantly different from 2021, again, we've built a little more context. You're like, oh man, something's really going on. You've picked some topics that are meaningful to Nebraska. Other ways you might group by year. So tends to be, if I'm showing something over time by year, I tend to use a line chart. I think it's one of the better ways to show trends. And that's what you're doing in a year. You're showing year-to-year analysis. So here for the last decade, the poverty rate has trended down in Nebraska, but has been increasing since COVID-19. I don't say it was 12.9 and it is 11.2. I help you to think about how it was coming down and then it went up. And I even give you an explanation essentially of why I think that is, right? It has to do with this COVID-19 year and changes since. So you can see that overall poverty rate coming up. This is a fairly long trend line. As I said, American Community Survey data is available back to 2010, so it's doable. Do I think you need really long trend lines? I really don't. I think you really have to focus on the trend itself. So the rate of those that work from home dropped in 2022 from the recent high in 2021, rate of those 16 and over that work from home, 2018 to 2022. So I really just went back in sort of recent history. What I'll tell you is this number has always been about here from 2010, not particularly high, not particularly low. And then, yeah, that's a big increase. And now it's come down, which I think debunks a lot of myths about what's happened in remote work here in Nebraska, at least. So, right, I think show the trend. I don't actually know that this helps see this as much as I would like it. And when I'm trying to get people to learn from data visualization, which I think is what we're doing, it's kind of important to focus where I need you. And right here, that trend becomes really obvious, both up and down. This is from the Nebraska Tech Collaborative Data Dashboard, where we compared the number of people that work in non-tech occupations to the number of people that work in tech occupations. But what I've done is built in some really easy analysis, like all of us are able to do this. It's the percent change. Obviously, I can't do a percent change because I didn't go for this 2011 time period because I didn't do the time period before, but you'll see the non-tech workforce has grown over time. The tech workforce has really grown significantly since 2016 to 2021. Now, I didn't do the margin of error on that. I don't have to. 0.3 to 23.8 is a big difference. So I feel comfortable using that term. Doesn't really look like a big difference because the scale is a little off. So that's why I really wanted to offer that percent change. One, this is a direct question our client asked us when building this. They want to know about the change over time. So if that's what they want to know, I want to build that in. Yeah, I want to give them a visual versus just giving them the number, but honestly, it's the number that they use more than visual. This visual is actually an interactive online, so it's kind of hard to read in this format. They need that number. So there you go. You have the number built into the visual. Build that analysis directly into the visual. If there's something you want people to know or see, it's got to be in the visual versus trying to figure it out yourself. I think the number 2 view in this dashboard, I might show it at some point, is just a map with the number of people that work in non-tech versus tech by state in the United States. It doesn't build in what we really want to know. Yeah, you can see the different years, but someone would have to calculate that percent change over time. This is one that we are comparing by year. This is totally off topic for a second because it actually comes from the current population survey, which is a U.S. Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics product. It is done monthly, so the data is released a little bit more often. It's a much smaller survey, but still asked really great questions about the workforce. The only reason I put this together is something happened between 2021 and 2022 that actually unnerving for me. One of the explanations I've been offering for domestic outmigration when people leave Nebraska for another state is that they're moving because of job opportunities. And I think if you access last year's data series presentation, which is available on the website, that's what I talked about the most. Why do I think that is happening, right? I triangulated a couple different data sources because we don't have something very specific to that to be able to answer that question. And I always said it was job opportunities. And here in 2021, you see that among the reasons people moved between states, family, job, housing, and other, job was the largest. So I felt really good about where the analysis I was offering. It changed. So in 2022, only about 12% of folks are saying that, while this one, housing, has jumped up tremendously from 17.6% to 34%. Because it was so unnerving, I really didn't want to do any fancy data visualization. I just want you to have those numbers. I want everybody to be on the same page that something shifted. Now, in text, I really talk about this change. So you really need the context to get at, oh, she's showing me something here. But I think when you're trying to help people along, if they need the numbers, just give them the numbers. Sometimes fancy data visualization actually gets in the way of communicating information that you think is important. So one way to compare and contrast by year. The next one is geography, similar to what we talked about this morning, but I'm not going to show rural and urban differences necessarily in this presentation. We do a lot of data by county, metro, micro, and non-metro or micro. We're really known for that, but because I wanted to work with the 2022 one-year release, as was mentioned, I want to work at the metropolitan statistical level or metropolitan statistical area level or higher. So I mostly work with states here. Nebraska median household income trails most neighbor states. This is median household income for 2022. Like I already said, it actually went down from 2021, which we think is pretty interesting. Also explains why we saw poverty go up. All right, those two things are related by definition. So here's a map. Everyone likes a map. Like, number one, can I get a map for that? And I like a map too. This map, just so you know, was made in Tableau. I would say this presentation is a little bit more Tableau heavy, but I still use Excel for a lot of my data visualizations. I'll try to point out which ones are. So all those year graphs were, those year by year line graphs, those were all Excel. Tableau for mapping, especially if you're using geographies, it knows, which it knows a lot of them. It knows metro, it knows state, it knows county. It knows a couple more. They already have them in. You can also add custom shape files. It's not that hard, but if you're new to mapping, it's pretty easy because it has that data available to you. Just a couple tweaks to your data and you're off and running. Everyone likes it, and there's great reasons. It does a lot of lifting, right? It presents a lot of information at one time. Even if it's by county, for instance, we have more counties than states. Someone asked me if I prefer Tableau or GIS for mapping. I think GIS is for geographic analysis versus geographic visualization. It makes good visualizations, but its main sort of purpose is to add this multiple layers of data and then to be able to sort of create custom maps or do custom analysis based on geographies that aren't really standard. I tend to work with really standard geographies and I'm just trying to make a quick visual. So I find Tableau easier. I also know Tableau better and use it more often for different things than I do for GIS. So that is my choice. It makes more beautiful maps and the interactive components are similar and things like that. So both have benefits. I use Tableau because I'm not doing analysis with my maps. I'm visualizing my maps. So it does a lot of lifting, a lot of information in a small amount of space. It's meaningful to folks. People know their geography. I live in a state, I live in a city, I know my county, I know my neighborhood, even within my city, right? So geography is a super meaningful attribute. I can drive 5 miles away and I know that neighborhood and why they differ. And so when I see that information on a map, I go, oh, this means something, right? It's building comparison and contrast right into the visual. It's not without challenges, though. I think one, it can be a little harder to make in some instances for folks, people that don't have as much knowledge using data viz. I think so. The comparison and contrast I want you to make here, I said neighbor states, right? And so you have more information than within the neighbor states. And then actually, if you look at most of our neighbor states, they're in the same color coding. So, right, what's different? You know, like it's not necessarily obvious. I really have to sit here and look at each one to be able to make this analysis. So I've kind of set you up for failure. I've told you something, and if you want to accept that, that's fine. But if you really want to know that, there's some challenges in looking at this information. Even though it's color coded, what's high and what's low is not always as easy to pick up. Here's another way to display geographic information, especially if I'm trying to make a statement like this. It trails most of its neighbor states, or it trails in the US. So here I've used the number we've looked at already. 10.8% of those that work in Nebraska report working from home. Rate of those 16 and over that work from home in 2022. Right. The first rule of data visualization, without a doubt, is if you can't read it, it's not good. And I mean, I can't say that. I'm not trying to be snarky, but I think there's this idea that putting data into an interesting format is somehow more important than being able to take information away from it. And it's just not true. If you can't read it, someone else can't read it, it's pointless, it's meaningless. I actually think it distracts from your credibility, and now no one's listening to anything you say. I really believe that's true. As I put up this graph, that is really hard to read. So I'm aware that it's hard to read. Here's what I will say. It does something that I don't think the map can do necessarily. So if I want you to know about Nebraska, you know, I'm giving you all of this information, but I'm not really telling you where we sit. And I know these are two different data points, but I want you to know where we sit in this. And especially because scales can be large, right? It kind of all looks the same to me. Something like this, particularly in the color coding. It's not in the actual visual that makes this work, but in the color coding. Can everyone find Nebraska here? It's in red. I should probably actually say right here, Nebraska is in red. I think I thought about it last night to change it. Okay, but if I had done that and you knew Nebraska was in red, if I tell you, is Nebraska high or low? If I ask, is Nebraska high or low? Bam, you know the answer right off the bat. It's, you know, it's not high, it's not really in the middle, it's towards the lower end. Great, right? If that's all I need you to take away, where we sit in context, in contrast to other places, this is a great map for doing this. I just made it for a group. I was trying to show labor force participation rates of women in Nebraska, and we were the third highest in that case. The visual is ugly, but on a map, it just didn't stand out as much as I wanted it to, because there are high labor force participation rates for women in every state. Other way to do this is to add the rank into the map. And I am starting to do this pretty regularly, and I didn't used to do it before. So here's Nebraska's poverty rate of 11.2 for the 2022 1 year, like I said. Again, you have some visual clues. Red is high, gray is low. So I don't put a lot of legends on my map because I think it can just be a little bit distracting. I want people to look at the map. I label everything so much. I will say some people disagree with that as sort of a rule for data visualization. But what I've done here, because this doesn't look very clear here in the middle where rates are pretty similar, I've added the rank in the 50 states. So that can be really useful. This one, something's wrong. And if you want to throw it into the chat, Someone asked if I use micromaps to compare regional values, combines a dot plot with a linked smaller value. So great point. Most of the data we're using with the United States Census Bureau is already summarized. So I don't have original surveys to be able to do, here's where multiple people are, a dot plot. I'm already using summarized values when I'm working with Census Bureau data, but also in here you mentioned some online tools as well as other great ways to make visuals, and I think they're all important. Thank you for that. So what's wrong with this map? So what I've done here is I've color coded on the estimate. So in this case, like 10 million people versus Nebraska, 142,000. I've told you about the percent. I've also told you about the estimate. And I've said it's comparatively high for the region, but not for the US. 7.2% of Nebraska's population is foreign born. That's actually down from 7.4%. It's not necessarily significant, but in most states, that number went up over time, while ours is has gone down. So I wanted to point that out. I think it's really interesting. We've also recently done this infographic on the foreign born population. So really interested in what's happening with that group of folks. So what I've done here is I've color coded on the estimate because I do think that actually the estimate is important. 7.2% is actually relatively high in the region. It's not relatively high for the US necessarily, but more importantly, 142,000 people compared to 5 million, compared to 10 million, compared to 5 million, 4.8 million down in Florida. Those are big numbers. Yes, those percentages are a little bit larger, but they're much larger numbers as well as percentages. So I did want you to have both pieces of information, but here I color coded on the estimate. And it just totally obscures the information because, right, California just has more people and then it has more foreign born population. And so like, I can't see any difference. So this rate is comparatively high for the region, but not for the US. I can't see that information. This is one time where I don't think, oh, I've also given you estimate, rank, and number. So that's great. You have a lot of information, but because I've obscured reading or interpreting the information, right? Like see what happens when the colors go away, like especially if I wanted to show the rate and the estimate, because and maybe I want you to focus in the region, or maybe I really want you to focus to those sort of outlier states like California, Texas, and Florida, so you realize like it's different. So I don't know that a map is the best way to show it's different. So contrast versus compare. I actually made a map just like this the other day for the Nebraska Tech Collaborative dashboard. This is how I dealt with it there. I think there are other ways to deal with it. I wanted people to have the estimate number. I think the estimate number was really important. We're talking about the workforce and how many people work in individual tech occupations, right? So it's easy to say, oh, in this case, oh, it's 25%. That sounds high to folks to have a lot of software developers. But just like this one, that number isn't very big because we have a much smaller population. So I really wanted people to have both. So I gave them both. So on the map, and again, this is an interactive online, please check it out. There's also a survey to give us feedback on it. Right, you could roll over and see the exact number. And then right next to it, I gave you the percentage with the state rank. Other really important thing when I'm doing this, order the data. Order the data. Now, if you're showing regional data and you want to do it in some other pattern, fine. But I think to show any kind of bar or line without that ordering, it really just doesn't communicate information. So going back, like think about this one if I did it alphabetical. Even if I colored in Nebraska, you would have no idea where we stand in this data. You would just know Nebraska is in the alphabet, right? And that's not, I don't have a desire to tell people about Nebraska in the alphabet. I have a desire to tell people where we stand in the states, right? So I am pro ordering data on meaningful fields, not alphabetically, even though it is easier to find Nebraska that way, especially if you weren't going to color code it, right? So when Tableau makes this, it puts them alphabetically and it makes every single one a different color. That is just not a useful way to show information. right, alphabetical doesn't communicate where we stand. So again, build some analysis into your data visualization, right? I haven't done fancy analysis. I've just ordered the data, which is sort of an automatic tool, but I've told people so much by doing that. Well, if I had just said, here it is, I actually just saw someone make a bar graph of counties alphabetically. And I mean, we have a lot of counties. It's impossible. Like, it doesn't tell me anything. So here's how I dealt with it in this case. I gave you the percentage and the number. If I want you to have both, give me both, but jamming it all on a map just doesn't make. Grouping, compare and contrast by grouping. This is a population pyramid. It's based on the 2022 one-year data, gives you population in 5-year age groups. I do normally say don't focus on specific counts as much as I focus on percentages. So here's our population, how it stands, what's wrong, and specifically thinking about comparison and contrast. What are we trying to do when we group data, and what don't we group here? Really just giving you a lot of data. So population pyramids create a shape that people are actually really used to. Now, because I don't follow rules, I actually do my population pyramids upside down. So population pyramids usually have older age groups on top, with the idea being those are supposed to be smaller, younger age groups are supposed to be larger. It's a pyramid. That's why we call it a population pyramid. I really struggle that people don't read that way, and the lifespan I don't think works in people's minds that way, so I don't like it. I really try to focus in my data viz on how people read. I try to give you all the information you need from here, coming down, coming down, coming down. That's how people read, right? Right to left, coming down the page. So Microsoft Excel, for instance, gives you legends at the bottom. That's its default. I think you need the legend to interpret the information, not necessarily here, but in a grouping one like we'll get to, right? I think anytime I have to do this and my eyes are darting around the screen, I'm not learning, my eyes are darting, right? Like, I'm spending time looking versus learning. And so I really try to focus on how people learn in my data viz. So yeah, this doesn't have that. That's true, but I have now followed how people think about age groups. I definitely see some things, but I haven't really grouped information in a meaningful way for folks. And that's the challenge here. I've given you data, but I haven't told you what data means. So here I've added some words, which definitely helps. While those in the prime age workforce are the largest age group at 49%, the young are only a slightly larger age group than the baby boomers. Here, I actually could care less about this population group. I don't think it's really telling anybody anything that they necessarily need, other than people are used to looking at population data in a pyramid. All you need is this. All you need is this. I think, would I show this? Do I show this? So when I'm talking to folks, yeah, I think the data viz builds a little credibility. People go, oh, here's the data behind the analysis. But this is the analysis. These 3 groups, that's what you need to know. In my interpretation of this data, somebody might be interested in some other aspect. This number, millennials are a larger group than Gen Z or whatever. Like, it depends on your analysis, what you would group. But here, this is what I'm interested in. I do a lot of workforce analysis. Here you go. Everybody says we have workforce challenges now. We don't. We're going to have them, right? This group retires. This group is not much larger. We're stuck, right? So I think I show this, great, people want the data, but this is the analysis. This is the grouping that makes sense. And I think we just make a lot of mistakes showing data and not analyzing data, especially by these groupings, right? We have so much available, so we show it all. You got to group in meaningful ways. So I said at the beginning, Nebraska's rate of those that work in production, transportation, and material moving occupations significantly declined in 2022 from the 2021 rate of 14.6 and now ranks 4th in the region. So I've told you information I haven't visualized, which you're going to see throughout this presentation. I don't think you have to visualize every single thing you might ever say. I think that would probably be a waste of time and overwhelm folks. But I've given you a reason why I'm showing this data. Here, I'm showing you some data. I give you two reasons. One, it's down, so I want to see what's up with that, but I also want to see how that compares. Here, I've chosen a bar graph, even though I'm looking at regional data, and it's because I'm looking at multiple groupings of data. If I just showed you production, transportation, and material moving, if I just showed you this column and I said Nebraska was 13.8, and I even said it was fourth in the region, I would give you some information. But I think it's really hard for people to think about things that are parts of a whole without their whole. So if I say production, transportation, and material moving is 13.8%, right? I cover all this information. Again, you know how it compares in the region, but wait, that's an occupation grouping. What are the other occupation groupings? I don't know anything about occupation groupings. Do we have a lot of occupation groupings, or do we just have a few occupation groupings? That seems like 3 and 1. You know what I mean? Like, it's bringing up more questions than it's answering. And that's parts of a whole data is definitely like that. You have to present it in the whole. But here with this, I've given you a piece of information I didn't visualize, but now you know why we're looking at it. I've ordered the data in a meaningful way within the region, within my neighbor states. Now that is a choice that I make. So some Midwest region, USDA, just like the Census Bureau, USDA defines it one way. Census Bureau defines it, I think they define it the same as the USDA, but I would have to check. There's always a couple states on the fringes that don't know a lot. Some people use 4 or 5 classifications, some use 7 or 8 for what is a region, right? Neighbor states touch us, so I do that. Sometimes I like to include North Dakota, but it's not a neighbor state. So then I might say in some of the Midwest or something like that. I make all sorts of choices in my data analysis. I try to make choices that I think are meaningful and explanatory. A lot of times in Nebraska, neighbor states, we know them, we're interested. There's a competitive environment in some way, so it kind of gets people focused. Oh, I'm just looking at what I need. What if I had done this for all 50 states? That would have looked like it would have been almost impossible to read. So I did it that way. I went ahead and ordered them. I don't know that it's particularly meaningful, but now I kind of know where we stand. We're in the middle. That's kind of interesting. We have neighbors higher and lower than us. What does that mean? The only thing I hate, I did make this, normally I make bar graphs in Excel, and the reason is for this because of labeling. I think the labels should be in there. I pretty much hate legends, and if I can find a way to get rid of them, I will. I don't like the up and down, left and right compare, even here, like, is that different than that? I don't know, but if I could just put the label in there, it would be better. Tableau you can, but it's a little bit more difficult. That's why I make most of them in Excel. I already have the data in Tableau, so I just was moving forward. You can manually order the data in Tableau as well as sort the data. So that's also kind of interesting. Tableau, it was really, I had all 50 states of data. It was really easy to filter down to the states I wanted, more so than in Excel. I would either have to put a regions code in or just go find them. Well, this was, I just picked them out of the filters box. So highs and lows with both. I do. Then, right, the other thing of parts of a whole, I think we talked about this next, is sometimes the parts of a whole are a lot. I was really comfortable with this in a bar graph because there's not so much small data. They're nice, clear chunks. I could label them pretty easily. You could distinguish. Here's where you get into places where you can't distinguish. This is again from the Nebraska Tech Collaborative Data Dashboard. This is the employed count and tech occupations by state for 2019. Gone ahead and shown just Nebraska here. This is called a tree map, and it's called a tree map. It doesn't look like a tree. It's supposed to show hierarchies within this group. I tend to use these instead of pie graphs. So parts of a whole, easy way to show it is in a bar, but again, once you have lots of small slivers, it becomes hard. That's also true with pie graphs. So the sort of formal reason in data visualization people don't like pie graphs is because supposedly we're not good at reading angles, which I generally accept. I think it's a waste of space on the page. As you've probably seen, I like labeling my data. I like putting groupings right there in. And in a pie graph, when I get these weird angles, it's actually really hard to label the data. And so then I have to have things going out, and I just think it looks really messy. Like, that's my deal with it. So this is a tree map, and these chunky boxes I think are just easier to label, and I think they take better space on a screen, right? My PowerPoint is a box, is a rectangle, so why wouldn't my viz be a rectangle like a bar versus this weird shape kind of in the middle? I can't play with pie graphs, and I know a lot of people don't like them in data viz. I think my reasons might still be a little difficult. You do still have labeling issues down here at the bottom. Sometimes it doesn't matter. In those cases, I might have to do a couple things out, or I'm okay with changing my font as I go down, right? Assumingly it's lesser information, it's a smaller group. I don't need to tell you more about it. I just want to give you a sense of where we all lie. They're called tree maps because they're supposed to show hierarchy. So within these, there's supposed to be information. So like, you're supposed to be able to drill down. I just use them instead of pie graphs to show parts of a whole. Okay, X impact on Y. I think if the purpose of data visualization is to help people understand information, to go from lots of data to knowing something, X impact on Y is probably where you want to go, right? Essentially, to this portion, we'll call these descriptive statistics, right? We are just describing a point in time. We are describing, in contrast, a place in time. We are grouping things that are related. But X impacted Y infers, it's an inferential statistic. You're trying to say, when this happens, this happens. That's correlation, that's inference. It is not causation. I was just reading in a book here, Little Bites of Big Data. So, right, if you do a search for regression analysis, which is a fancy inferential modeling approach, like most people, right, like do like a new search of regression analysis, people aren't putting regression analysis in the news. It's not very known to people. And I think that's fine. I think we can still look at X impact on Y without getting too much into the statistics. So I'll show that to you, but I really caution folks, because when you say something impacts something else, people tend to believe you. And if you're not really sure that that's true, even if the relationship looks right, don't mess with it. This is my favorite graph. I think I made it the year I got here, and I've been using it ever since, updating the data. Of course, this is for 2022, 1 year. As educational attainment increases, median income increases. This is a positive relationship, and it's just really clear to see. It's also doing a lot of work for me. It's telling you a lot of information in groups, as well as what the income, right? So I'm giving you different groups, different information, parts of a whole, so as a bar, as well as what that is related to. Now, I am inferring something. There is a relationship between educational attainment and income. I believe that to be true. You know, it is true in the data, but I really believe they're related. I know that to be true, right? Like, you know, maybe educational attainment increases. I have to think of some example, but right, we all know those correlation, not causation, right? This one, I believe there is a causal pattern. It's not everything. It's not the only reason why income goes up. We know that too, right? Mark Zuckerberg does not have a degree, a bachelor's degree, but his income is high. So it's not everything, but I know these things to be related. So I have no problem showing them together. And then the clarity of the pattern, I think, just like eases the mind. You're like, oh yeah, those things are related. Of course, these numbers are actually a little bit lower than they were for 2021. The median's a little bit lower. Pretty sure all of them are a little bit lower than for 2021. As I said, median incomes have come down, not necessarily in every grouping. I actually think maybe graduate or professional degrees a little higher. I can check that. But we get this real sense of the relationship. I also get to know a little bit more about levels of educational attainment. I will tell you that the total population that's high school graduate or higher has gone up. And it's actually gone up significantly between 2021 and 2022. And that's kind of new. There's really something happening there. So we're graduating more people. And if someone said, why is that a good thing? Well, one reason, incomes go up. I know the X impact on Y relationship here. I did make this in Microsoft Excel. It's a dual access chart for XY relationships. You're probably going to use a dual access or a scatter plot, which I'll show next. I did, however, go over these bubbles with white circles from Excel because it just, the line was crossing through the numbers. So I wanted to just clean it up a little bit. I do that all the time. It might look like Excel made it, and it almost made it, but it didn't totally make it. And I think that's, if you care about data visualization, you got to spend a little extra time to do things like that. I will tell you one thing that has also gone up is the percent of the population that has received an associate's degree. But I group them here. I group them for two reasons. The percent of the population that has an associate's degree is now at 12% from 11%. That is a significant increase. However, it is a small group in the population, so it doesn't always release the median income data at that level. It is higher than the less than high school graduate, but they go out of their way to make sure we have that data to be able to make this chart. Well, it doesn't necessarily in the associate's degree. I'd have to go to the microdata. For the 1 year data, I didn't want to go to the microdata. It's available, but it's a lot of work for not too much reward. Also, because then that's a smaller group in here, I think it messes up the aesthetic. Now, if I was talking about associate's degrees specifically in a presentation, I would really need to show that, right? I would need to show that. But usually I'm just showing this XY relationship. And I will say associate's degrees median income from past research does go up. So the XY relationship still works out. So it's worth showing in some senses, but it's not worth showing everything if it sort of confuses the point, right? All of a sudden there's a smaller bar down here. It actually goes, wait, what? Who's that? Why are they different? You know, it just doesn't look like a normal curve like this does. It's a choice I make. Some people disagree with it. The other way to show XY relationships is scatter plots. We just did a scatter plot in the housing quality and availability research brief we just put out. I cannot think of another time I've put a scatter plot in a brief. They definitely show XY relationships, and I think people are pretty good at reading them. I have a 9 and a 7-year-old, and both of them have been working on graphing, and essentially the 9-year-old is already kind of doing slope of a line. He doesn't know what those words mean, but they're doing that. So do I think people can read scatter plots? Yeah, but it's a lot. They're dense. And they're not necessarily as, right? So this is a positive relationship. It's essentially as intuitive as this. So if I can show this, which is blocky and clear, I would do it. The reason I can't, so I could make this, except this one is by state. I would have to have all 50 bars, and that looks really bad. If for some reason it's a smaller group, or I'm doing within 9 counties or something like that, as much as possible, I would try to do a dual access. I think it's easier to read than a scatter. I also think you're putting a lot of weight on yourself when you make a scatter plot, because people now think there's a relationship. You know, they might go from inference, there could be a relationship to, oh, they said that this causes this. And our brains work in causality, not correlation. So people are going to start to believe you. And unless you're really sure, don't let people. As the percentage of persons that work in management, business, science, and art occupation increases, the median household income increases. Percent of the population in management, business, science, and art occupations, and median household income by state. This goes back to that bar graph I showed you. We were looking at production. Now we're looking at management, business, science, and arts occupations. These, I know from past research, tend to have higher wages. So we would expect the more folks that work in these occupations, the higher the median household income. That is absolutely true. This is a pretty strong positive relationship too. It's almost 1-to-1, which is pretty interesting. What I've gone ahead and I did make this in Tableau. I make a lot of my scatter plots in Microsoft Excel as well. Here's the big difference. So just as easy to make, just as easy to label in Excel. And it's easier. So if I kept all of these gray it would be easy to mark the label Nebraska and turn off Kansas and Missouri. In Tableau, it's really easy to make that dot red, but a little harder to insist that it label that one and not label. In this case, it was Kansas. It would be easy, but let's say they had put a bunch of them. I would have to go and manually click those off. While Excel, if you say, no, make sure this one's labeled, it'll just do it. But the color coding in Excel is not as easy as it was in Tableau. So again, Nebraska's red, should have said it directly. You're really clear, right? And Nebraska is really close to, this is the slope of this relationship. This is what's telling me it's pretty much 1-to-1, like the more it goes this way, the more perfect the relationship. So here is pretty good. The reference line, I think, is helpful for folks seeing that. We didn't talk about it too much this time, but there's this idea of chart junk, lots of lines, labels, I think a reference line is always helpful, right? Like it's just telling you, I want you to look how close everything is to this line. So I think like a percent change, it's building in analysis. It's telling you what to look at. It's not always telling you what to look at though. So just be careful of things like that. And right, so showing this graph maybe with that bar graph, those two together are telling a really complete story. Here's what percentage of our folks are in these. Here's how each one relates to household income, right? And strong relationship that I feel comfortable showing as a scatter plot because I'm going to assume people are going to take me seriously. This is a inverse relationship or negative relationship. The two things go in different rates. Different directions. As the vacancy rate in the state goes down, the median home price of owner-occupied units goes up. Actually, I'll ask you all, would you all show this one? So I feel very clear that vacancy rates are related to home prices. So think about it. If there's a lot of vacant homes in a neighborhood, maybe people aren't moving into them. Maybe they've been vacant for some time and they're in some level of disrepair so that, it's affecting the home prices next to each other. So I'm really sure they are related. They are related. It's not as strong as a relationship. And that's right. The dots are farther away from the line, suggesting, yeah, there's a relationship, there's a pattern, but it doesn't follow as neatly as this one does. So this one's a little harder to see. We said we see some yeses. We see a lot of no's in the chat on that. I think it's hard to show an inverse relationship as a scatter plot, right? Like my mind doesn't, it's like how we read, right? My mind wants to go that way or even that way, but this is kind of in the middle and all over. Nebraska is about as far away from the trend as anywhere. So if I'm really trying to make a point about Nebraska, it's a little less clear. Now it's still a relationship. As the vacancy rate in the state goes down, median home prices do go up. In the housing quality and availability brief, we did it by county. That relationship is much, much stronger. And actually we did it by vacant housing and percent of the population that's moved into the county since 2010. And that line's really good. It's still an inverse relationship, but it's really good, right? Places where people are moving don't have a lot of vacant housing. So it says something about the housing stock availability and quality. And we did that one by county. So I did end up showing that one. Tell you what, though, I could just say it. I don't think right? Like this X impact on Y, people know this makes sense to people, right? Like I can put context in myself. I don't know that the dots help that much with the context. Hopefully that makes sense, right? Is knowing that Hawaii's off the chart and West Virginia above the chart, the reference line, and West Virginia is below the reference line, helping you to understand X's impact on Y? I don't think it is. So like I can make a visual. It can tell a very important story. Like if I did research on this, this would be a variable I would include. It's important. There's something going on here. But is knowing where states fall on this really telling me anything very important? Like I said, I think the county one, because the relationship is tighter and it's by county and it's about how people are moving around the state, there's something I want to convey there. There's something I want to convey here about our level of competitiveness both on household income and our sort of business sectors. Like there is information I want to convey here. I don't know that I really care. I think this might be more interesting regionally. Okay, I had Iowa here, but I don't know if I can find Kansas somewhere in here, right? So I can make it. Do I need it? And I think a lot of you agree with me. You would not. Here is another way I've shown X's impact on Y. This is when I start to be really careful. Oh, we are at 10:45. I got to go. So here I looked at men versus women and wages in the tech sector. And I really decided not to show this an XY relationship. I don't think men and women are the reason wages are different. It is the experiences of men and women in the workforce that make them different. So just be careful what you're showing as X impact on Y, because people really overinterpret some of those scatterplots or other types of ways of showing that. Context clues is my last point for you. In Nebraska, as of August 2023, we have 1 month supply of homes for sale. Useful piece of information. I made a fancy map. Probably should put some notes on why there's no data available for them, but it just doesn't mean anything. I think you can show the map, but you have to give them the information. Actually, according to the Realtors Association, the number of units of sale should be about 6 months of supply, right? I don't need that in the data visualization, right? Like, what am I going to do? Like put a line through the 1 and say 6 instead, right? It makes no sense. You have to use your text. Nebraska's comparatively low rate of those that work from home is likely a function of the work most people do in Nebraska. Again, I've given you a map with a lot of information, but I've really failed to tell you anything about why I care about that. I really need some text. This is straight from the remote work one if you want more information. This is from the foreign born. Sometimes you don't need a lot of text. In this particular example, what I like here is that these headings just take you right along. It really lets you know what's going on. We really used grouping here in a lot of ways to tell you a lot of information in a really short amount of time without making you stress out. What goes together? How does that work? And then we've also really used our titles well just to make the point without a lot of words. This is the poverty infographic. Again, we use words here, a map, and an image. Hit people over the head with the point you want to make. If you want them to take something away from it, it's not a one and done. So there are my thoughts on comparison and contrast. Couple quick takeaways for decoding. I'll leave those with you. Everything's going to be on the website. I don't have a lot of questions coming into the Q&A or chat. If anybody wants to get those in really quick, you have like a second. If not, right, we're going to put everything out on the webpage. You'll have access to it. I have an email address, and you can always email me with other questions about today. Thanks all for spending the morning with us.